Thank you, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started with this most amazing session. This is my most favorite. This is our ALGS expert panel, and if we've got an hour buffer should we go over time, so we're all right with that. And I do want to announce that after this, we're going to do a group picture on the stairs, so everybody stick around so we can get our regular group picture. So we'll go ahead and kick it off. I'm going to have everyone introduce themselves, and we're just going to barrage them with questions.
Are you giving us all the mics? Yes. Could you not give one to Benita?
Here, Kathy. Here, Bruno.
That seems fair.
Here you go.
All right, so I guess I'll kick things off. My name is Henry Lin. I'm a pediatric GI doc. Used to be at CHOP with so many friendly faces, and recently moved out west to Portland, and so I'm leading up the GI team out at OHSU.
And I think you've all met me by now, Nancy Spinner, geneticist at CHOP.
David Piccoli, gastroenterology, now hepatologist at CHOP.
I'm Ruben Quiros. I'm a pediatric gastroenterologist. I'm Omaha, Nebraska, University of Nebraska. I was in Philadelphia also as a resident, and Thomas Jefferson. Everybody here has a Philadelphia link. I would just want to stress that out.
Kathy Looms, pediatric hepatologist at Children's Hospital, Philadelphia. Here we go. Okay, try that again. Kathy Looms, pediatric hepatologist at Children's Hospital, Philadelphia.
Hi, Benita Kamath, pediatric hepatologist at Toronto. Roberta, do you need a mic? Or can I say it? We're open for questions.
Do you need?
Oh, I do.
Benita's.
I'm so sorry, Benita. He's the godfather, though. I have to listen. So this is we're just gonna ask him questions and whatever you got. Who wants to start? I did have one question right here.
So my question is, we've heard about patient databases. Is there a doctor database?
Oh my God, yes. Go online. Everybody. Vitals has one. You know that you can.
They want to know who's going
Alagille.
Oh, Alagille. We talked about this a little bit in one of our rooms. You know, for pediatrics, there is a directory of all the pediatric gastroenterologists in the country. But to sort of get a referral, the best thing to do is to get your doctor to kind of set you up, you know, with someone if you're moving, if your kid is moving. And I would say that Roberta and Cher really should, like, part of what they're going to do when they enhance their website, right, Sandra? They're going to be #1 on the, you know, website. They will have their list of trusted and certified Alagille experts, and my guess is Roberta will probably charge us to be on that list, but, you know. Okay, now I'm done. It's Benita's turn.
So we've been telling you guys all weekend what we want to know as families. What do you guys want to tell us about what you experience when you're treating Alagille patients, and what kind of advice can you give families?
I think one thing that always impresses me is how incredibly knowledgeable our Alagille syndrome family, parents, the families become. And I think sometimes there's frustration when people say, but I know more about this than my doctor. And I would say that's okay. I think when you are the parents or the family of somebody with a rare disease, you do get better than some of the doctors that you see. And I think that that's all right. And what you want to do in finding your primary doctor, or when you're in the emergency room, you want to find physicians who will partner with the experts. I don't think we, the Alliance, even yourselves, are going to make every physician that you meet into an expert in Alagille syndrome. It's okay if you're the expert, but hopefully you can identify physicians that are part of your care team who are willing to learn and who are willing to partner with people who know more. I hope that makes sense. And in the same way, I just want to make it clear that all of us up here, we also go and get second opinions from other experts about other diseases. We don't know all the diseases. We happen to be very attached to Alagille syndrome, and yes, so we are experts on that, but we're also willing to partner when we have patients that have other rare diseases that we don't know that much about. But I think that's what you want to look for in your care team, is physicians, nurses, dietitians, people who are willing to learn and people who are willing to partner. And it's okay if you know more than them as long as they're open and willing to learn.
Dr. Kamath, before you pass that away, yesterday in the research roundtable, you spoke a lot about we saw some frustrations with some of our families who their doctors didn't know Alagille syndrome, and they would get very frustrated about that. Can you just share what you were telling us yesterday, a different way? Maybe we can look at that.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what a little bit what I'm alluding to, is that you won't necessarily, if they haven't heard of it at all, then hopefully you can help educate them. And we were talking, Cher, about perhaps having, putting a couple of good review articles about Alagille syndrome on the website, or having links to them that you can then print out and maybe hand to a physician that doesn't know that much about Alagille syndrome. And if that person is open and willing to learn, then that's great. You can still have somebody be a partner in the care of your child. But if that person really isn't interested in it, then maybe that isn't the right person to be your carer. Is that what you're getting at, Cher, or was there something else that I said?
You had also said, if your physician that you first are going to, your pediatrician or whatever, doesn't know about Alagille syndrome, that doesn't mean that they're not a good doctor.
Yes, that's right, exactly. And it doesn't mean, I think as long as they're open and willing to learn, but they don't, it's not possible for all the physicians that you meet to know about all the rare conditions that they are, and it doesn't make them not a good doctor. I think, though, that if they're not willing to learn, then it's going to be difficult for you to partner with them. And I always give this example. I say, you wouldn't go back to a hairdresser that you don't like. And the women are mostly going to nod the room, and some of the men, right? So why would you go back to a doctor that you just don't connect with?
Well, since it's passing the microphone alone, I think, throughout the years, for me, just want to mention that I look forward coming here. When I start my fellowship, I did some research in Alagille, and after that, I have not done a lot of research in that area, but the syndrome has remained close to me, and I'm part of the GALA, the database, and all those things. But one thing I also take from the patients, besides what Benita mentioned in regard to how much knowledge they have, how these kind of meetings help them to stay up to date and learn a lot about. I mean, the lecture about genetics today, I was listening. I mean, you got a top-notch thing, and I'm sure that I heard the scientific meeting was really good and a lot of stuff. And those are things that even PDGI any PDGI will actually learn from those lectures. Then the level of the meeting is really good. And the other thing I learned throughout the years is coming here is that you learn about the patient perspective. I came very involved in these meetings at the beginning of my career, and you learn to appreciate the parents' perspective when you come to a meeting like this, what they think about, what comments that you learn that I shouldn't be saying that because it doesn't come across in the way I thought it will come across. But it's a lot of a learning process here for at least for me as a physician during this process. But I always use the same principle as Benita mentioned, is that, it's okay to know more about the condition because it's something that regular doctors, pediatricians don't see all the time, PDGI, they don't see all the time, and just ensure that your doctor is willing to learn about it. And follow recommendations. We do with some other diseases that we don't see as much.
So I had a question. You guys had mentioned how whenever Dr. Alagille first talked about Alagille syndrome, that his kidneys weren't on the radar for him. As more of all of us kind of get together and start sharing, oh, my child, did this and this and this and stuff. Have you guys noticed, or is there, moving forward, any other systems that you're expecting that Alagilles may also be impacting that it wasn't thought about 30 years ago, or just, as we kind of start picking up patterns between our kids, of course, it could always be just another random thing, but it does seem like there are some like, oh yeah, this is strange for my child, but hey, you also, your child's also popping out with that. And how do we articulate that to our doctors so that information becomes, just more readily available and acknowledged and that kind of thing?
I think that, we haven't seen everything and we haven't reported everything, but you almost can expect that anything can happen, and many of those things happen in people without Alagille, but there are at least 2 people who are missing 1 ovary and fallopian tube. There are a lot of other people who have never had that looked for. We've seen with the bones, we've now seen a couple of kids, one was like really old, where the forearm bones are fused and they can't do this. And it's kind of like, how can you get to be 10 years old and not recognize that you can't pronate and supinate, But these are the kind of things that I think there aren't going to be so many more things that we didn't know about, but then there's some things that we suspect that we need to be much better about. I mean, neurocognitive, we're just starting to really be able to pay more attention to that. Other things about, perfusion of the brain fog. There are a number of people who've talked about that. And some of the things, differences in the hands. Nancy's husband one time met one of our patients and shook hands and said, "Oh my goodness, can you see that?" And I saw nothing, of course. And he's looking at the hand, and there's an extra crease in the middle 2 fingers, and he wrote a paper on it, so now everybody, knows about that. It kind of jokes about it because it doesn't really mean that much. He didn't get promoted based on that paper. But he got promoted. But he got promoted. Yes, he did. So, but I think we do need to be aware, there are things in this pathway that might matter immunologically or oncologically or other things. And but really the last 30 years, people keep reporting things. And if something happens 1 in 300, it's probably not that important. But now the nice thing is you see something unusual and you can do a real search, like we go on these, literature searches like Ovid and the thing, or PubMed, or you can just do like a Google search. And, sometimes you get a hit and you're like, wow. So, but we do, in places like this, people are more likely to be able, one, to say to another, "Oh yeah, I have that. I saw that." And so there's an ability to not just support research in here, but to do discovery. I mean, I think in our first couple of, picnics, on outside of Philadelphia, when you get 10 or 15 or 20 people together and you can just even look and you can say, wow, many people have a different sort of shape of their femur and their hip bone, things that you wouldn't otherwise recognize. It's important to, keep reporting the things that look like they matter.
But just to expand on that for a minute, I don't know that going home to your physician is going to be the best way to get that, because they may see they may have 3 patients in their practice, in a practice that's seen a lot of Alagille syndrome. And perhaps there is a role for the Alliance and the Scientific Advisory Board, because certainly something that people like us could be involved with, but you might have rotating people and there are other places. But the people on your advisory board are going to be physicians who are really invested in Alagille syndrome and have a particular interest, and that's where you might want to get some of those things. Because, we could, if we find, I think that since we found the gene and we could test individuals and see really who has a mutation, we've learned a lot about the heart disease because there were people who had JAG1 mutations who didn't have full-blown Alagille syndrome. We've learned a lot about the kidney disease. We've learned a lot about the vascular problems. And this was all because you had some researchers who were invested. And this, aside from the fact that we're also interested in this, these are our jobs. Our jobs are to think about what are the other things that might be important in this disorder. And so we're thinking about that a lot. So it might be something, and we can talk about it. I know we were going to come to a board meeting tomorrow, but just what kinds of mechanisms can we set up so you guys are really aware of issues that families have raised. I don't think we know enough about adults with Alagille syndrome. That just has not been studied as well. And I think that adults who go, who as they get older are seen less and less. They've kind of worked out a lot of their medical issues. And I think there are still some holes in what we can understand. So I think this is a good brainstorming thing, but now having 2 registries where people can go in and record all of that information is fantastic. So I think one of the things we do want to walk away with is to say those registries are really gold, because they really allow you to go in and anyone who is interested in something can go in and look things up. So if we can walk away where you guys set something up so that the board is kind of curating questions, and they can be crazy or not crazy, because sometimes crazy things lead to really interesting things, and to really try to get as many people involved with the registries as possible.
Thank you. Benita, can you speak to the gala regarding what families can do to make sure that, they can't just come to you and get their information? And so what is the process they take to help build this up?
That's speaking to your physician and saying that to really tell your physician that you think that it's really important, you think it's important for the community, you think it's important for your own family, and to encourage them, because they have to go through a process. Essentially, they have to get ethical approval at their site, and then they have to manually put the data into the database. So it really, just to be appreciative for their time, it does require time and effort on their behalf. Shannon, who's sitting over there, Shannon, stand up. I know I always keep making you stand up, but Shannon, who runs the database, will assist local sites with their ethical paperwork. So with all they have to go, they may have many, many pages of ethical approval that they have to receive, and it's different to every institution. They can send those blank forms to Shannon, and Shannon will do them for them and send them back. So that's what we are doing to help physicians to do that. But ultimately, at their site, somebody will have to go through the patient charts and manually enter the data, and that requires time on their part. And people use different mechanisms to have that done. I think, Henry, you're you're giving a medical student an opportunity to learn about
It is always a learning opportunity. That is what I've learned.
Right?
Yes.
But so some big centers, we have a lot of people we have a lot of research assistants or research coordinators, and at the bigger centers we have that. But you may be taken care of at a site where they don't have so many clinical research resources, and maybe in that situation, they may have to engage a student or a volunteer to enter those data, because it is time consuming for them to do it. So it's encouragement on your part, telling them you're interested. You can pick up a card from Shannon, give your physician that card, and hopefully they will get involved. I have to tell you that we've had big sites. We had a site from China that gave us 200 patients worth of data, but we've had small sites pick a small country, Shannon, Hungary, India, who give us 2 or 4 or 6. And to us, every patient counts. That's how you get to over 800. So even if you're at a smaller place where you think, what difference does it make if the 3 patients followed at this center? What difference does that make to a big database? It makes a difference. That's how we got to 800, was by getting all these patients in.
Hi. So if you're not sure if your physician's involved or your institution's involved, please feel free to come see me. I'd be happy to take down your physician's name and where you're followed, and I can reach out to them to initiate the process and see. I was going to say, I was just checking my emails, and I already had a physician and a family email me today, and their site's not involved. So I'm really excited to be able to reach out to them and start the onboarding process. Yeah, I think for the most... Yeah, I was going to say for the most part, it has been hepatologist or GI that we've been starting with, and then getting their medical records would all be there. Yeah. Oh, for families watching, they can email us. I can provide Roberta with our email address, but it's gala.study@sickkids, all one word, .ca.
Thank you.
That was my question, was just, if I'm not at a center like CHOP or whatever, are we trying to get, here's my cardiologist and get them uploaded, here's my GI, or you just want the one?
I think start with the GI, and then typically the GI will have a lot of those other relevant records. If you're all in the same institution, if they are, that they can pull them. But if they're not, typically the GI doctor, because we've talked about this before, but historically it seems like liver and GI doctors have been the coordinators of care here. So it's likely that they will have copies of echocardiograms in their GI notes, and they'll have copies of any brain imaging. It's probably they're the ones who even organize the brain imaging in their GI notes. And if not, we can always ask them to access them. But we can't directly go to, it'd be confusing if we had 4 different physicians. It's nice to have one coordinating person sending us everything.
It is important for our families to understand the power that you have to build up this registry. This registry will change the course of what we know about Alagille syndrome, period. And it's our responsibility to help change that and build it up, make it better. So please reach out to Shannon, reach out to us, let us know, who your physicians are so we can start continuing to build that database. So so many things are going to come out of that, and it's really, really super important. Well, I do want to ask, in several of the breakouts, some things came up like Chiari malformation, moya, other connective tissue issues. We have families on the support groups ask about autoimmune, ADHD, all these other things associated that maybe aren't as more, as common as in the groups, but that some folks have. They have a hard time connecting the pieces to understand if it's Alagille or not. Can you just touch on some of these other associated medical issues?
A little bit. It's funny that you mention Chiari malformation, because that's not something that certainly I've really thought of as a common feature of Alagille syndrome. But in the GALA database, we're identifying a number of Chiari malformations. So what we're now going to have to do, so this is where the research kicks in, we now need to understand that is that frequency of Chiari malformation in the Alagille syndrome greater than it would be in the non-Alagille population? So is it just the regular frequency of Chiari, because we know that Chiari occurs in many people, or is it something that is higher in Alagille syndrome? So that's how, I think what Dr. Piccoli was talking about earlier, are some of these things occurring in the Alagille syndrome population that they would occur in the non-Alagille population as well, or are these features associated with Alagille? And we're learning. I think it's a learning thing. The King's group in the UK have published about immune system issues, and they seem to believe that there are increased immune issues. I don't think we really think that patients with Alagille syndrome get serious bacterial infections. We don't see our patients on a high frequency developing meningitis or these types of serious bacterial infections. But since the King's group published that, it's something that I think we're keeping an open eye for, but I'm not sure that I am totally convinced by that yet. I wouldn't add that as an 8th system that I think is severely impaired, but I'm trying to keep an open mind. But it's always about trying to figure out, is it just happening because it's statistically happening, or it really is higher in the Alagille syndrome population? Because some things will just happen to everybody. It's like the fractures, right? Yeah. Like, we can talk about how you got the long bone fractures.
Yeah, I think that was one thing we were talking about a little bit earlier in the bone disease small group. Was that we had a study that we did a number of years ago where there was a survey that went out about growth in Alagille syndrome, and then within that group of patients there were a smaller subset of patients who had actually had fractures, and then we kind of went back and found out more information about those fractures, and it was only 12 patients in that group that had fractures, but among them they had 27 fractures, so that was a lot of fractures. And we looked at what type and which bones and what mechanisms of fracture they had, and it turned out that many of the patients had actually had long bone fractures in the legs, so femur fractures, which are typically really not happening in children unless they have major trauma like a car accident or something, a really serious trauma. And in these particular patients, they were happening with very minimal trauma. So then we looked at the whole population and how many fractures would be expected, and the way it's looked at is in person years, so how many years of life a person's had, and that one person, over their lifetime would they be expected to have a fracture, and how many fractures would you see in a certain number of people over a certain number of years. And it turned out that in that particular population, the expected rate of femur fracture was very low, and the femur fracture rate in this population was 50 times what would be seen in the general population. So that told us that we really were seeing a real difference in the serious fractures in the Alagille population as opposed to people who didn't have Alagille syndrome. So it might be something similar to that. If there's information known about what is the frequency of Chiari malformation or something else in the general population, and then kind of looking at, in that database of 850 people, how many do you have, and what's the percentage of people that have it, and then trying to sort out whether this is really just true and unrelated, or if it's really something that's related to the underlying diagnosis.
I'd like to ask, we have different prevalence numbers. Can you speak to where you get the prevalence from? What is the understanding across the board for, is it 1 in 150,000, 1 in 30,000? Nancy, all mics on you.
I think I said this to some, I can't remember which group it was, sometime over the weekend, that, can't hold all of them, that what is the true frequency of Alagille syndrome? We don't really know. The first numbers that came out were, there was a 1976 study in Norway, I think, where somebody looked at the frequency of Alagille syndrome, 1976, so what was the diagnostic rate in the NICU, in the neonatal intensive care unit. So these were kids with cholestatic jaundice that were really sick. And that's where that initial, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, right? So that was that initial number, so 1 in 70,000. How many Alagille patients end up in the NICU before they're 10 months old? It's a percentage, but we now know that it's not the full percentage. So we actually went back and redid the calculations when all of us worked on this paper, that's Kamath et al. 2003, where we said, okay, let's try to figure out what's the frequency of Alagille syndrome among the relatives of patients with Alagille syndrome. And we removed the probands. Now, I don't know if this makes sense to you, but all of the proband is the person who identifies the family. So you think about a child who presents with heart disease, liver disease, butterfly vertebra. We know they have Alagille syndrome. But now let's remove them from the study and interview their relatives and see, of that group, we know 40% are inherited. So let's look among the group of people with JAG1 mutations, how many of them, what kinds of features do they have? And we know that only a small percentage of those people had liver disease, had heart disease. So we wouldn't, in that 1 in 70,000, none of those people were counted. And then how many people have a JAG1 mutation and maybe have 1 feature or 2 features, but they've never had a child with Alagille syndrome, so we're not counting them. So we know that it's definitely more common than 1 in 70,000, because that was the tip of the iceberg. And we tried to do a calculation based on what percentage of JAG1 people have those features, and we backed ourselves down to 1 in 30,000. So that is a very hand-waving kind of a number, but we know, so let's put things into perspective a little bit. The frequency of Down syndrome, there's about 1 in 1,600, it's all different ages. I think it's about 1 in 800 individuals is born with Down syndrome. So that's one of the most common genetic disorders. There are some other disorders, Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, that are about 1 in 1,000. And if you have a disorder that's 1 in 4,000, that's considered a common genetic disorder. right, as opposed to IBD. What's the frequency of inflammatory bowel disease, which is
1 in 100.
1 in 100. So that's a common disorder. That's a pretty big number. So Alagille syndrome is someplace between 1 in 30,000 and 1 in 20,000, 1 in 50,000, 1 in 15,000. So it's rare, but it's obviously not incredibly rare. There are some disorders where there are 2-3 people who are known with the disease. So we're certainly way beyond that.
Where's the rare disease prevalence line?
Oh, I should know this because I was just at the Rare Disease Alliance meeting.
And you should know this.
I should know.
1 in 200,000. We got to take her over here. 1 in 200,000. Is that correct, you think?
No.
200,000 patients.
Somebody can Google that, but it's
And
way
then-
higher.
yeah.
So having a rare disease, I
I'll
mean,
Google it while
obviously, if you,
So I-
I gave her a mic, she didn't give me one back. Oh.
No,
You know, I mean, there are different reasons why these frequencies matter. So the one study said that it's whatever number is the true number for people who seem to be affected for real, the number's 4 times higher than that, because the other people would never be diagnosed correctly. And if you think your diagnosis was hard, these other people, these relatives, pretty much all of them were not diagnosed with Alagille syndrome. Like only, a fifth of them were diagnosed with Alagille syndrome on their own. So you say like it's the tip of the iceberg. It does, and rare matters because the rarer your disease and the more complicated your disease, the less likely it is to get easy care and expertise, because you're kind of competing against literally thousands of other rare diseases. And as Nancy said, there are 20 plus a small amount of change, 1,000 protein coding genes. Many of those have diseases, and then we're learning that there are a whole bunch of diseases that are different from just those single genes. So what does matter a little bit is that the government has made a rare disease designation. The NIH has an Office of Rare Diseases. There are things to try to improve the science or the remuneration for developing therapy for rare diseases, because otherwise, why would you spend your entire life making a therapy for a disease that's only been seen 6 times? It might be brilliant science, but so there are those other incentives, but kind of in some ways, I don't know if I can make this come out the right way, which is a problem for me sometimes. Probably not, thank you. But, it's not a rare disease to you. You have it. And so whether it's 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 30,000, it happened, and you want to use that as a strength to move things forward rather than a weakness or a deficit.
So this is a question that comes up a lot at home, and there's confusion between prevalence and incidence.
I didn't get the mic for that question.
Yeah.
But okay, you can answer that, Henry.
You guys who got your master's in translational research, we'll combine it with this answer. So we did Google, and the definition of a rare disease is one that affects fewer than 200,000 people, which is different than which translates in the United States, based on our population, to about 1 in 1,500. So if there are 200,000 people affected, translates to an incidence, and I guess it's incidence and not prevalence. One of these master's people in translational research will address that. But we're talking 1 in 1,500, 200,000 people affected. So if we want to let's take the higher limit, and I'm going to claim 1 in 15,000 for Alagille syndrome, which would be a higher limit, I think, but that would be about 20,000 people in the United States, just to give you some sort of an idea, which is fascinating if there are 850 in a database that You've started, although you're in Canada, so
But it's the world. It's the world. It's the world.
Never
And the
mind.
prevalence, the prevalence
Never
is all the number of people that have a disease at a particular point in time, and the incidence is the new number of cases or the new numbers that you may say in live births per year. Okay, but so the prevalence would be today, right now, how many people in Cincinnati have Alagille syndrome? The number's gone up because of the symposium, but that's the prevalence, right? And the incidence is how many new diagnoses do you make in a year, and that would be the incidence. The one other thing that I would just say, though, I mean, I think also the absolute numbers are important, but I also think the relative numbers are important as well. So I don't know, I find it hard to get my head around 1 in 70,000, 1 in 30,000. What does that mean? So I'm going to try and, in a liver clinic, though, in a liver clinic or in your GI doctor's clinic, actually Alagille syndrome is one of the more common inherited rare liver diseases, if that makes sense. And I'll tell you how we know that. The Emory Genetics panel testing, the panel where lots of people are getting their genetic testing done right now, we looked at a couple of thousand of those results. And the results, so those are typically being sent in jaundiced babies or infants with liver disease. And the number one diagnosis that comes off that genetics panel is Alagille syndrome. So that tells you, so that's another way of looking, not just absolute numbers, but of the inherited liver diseases, Alagille syndrome is the most common. The other thing is that I would say biliary atresia is probably about 3 times more common. It's not an inherited liver disease, well, not as far as we know right now, but that's the disease that people always talk about in comparison to Alagille syndrome, right? So roughly it's about 3 times as common. Would you agree? Roughly? So that's what, if we believe in that, roughly. But of the inherited diseases, of the diseases where we have a genetic cause, Alagille syndrome is actually the most common inherited liver disease.
I know that you have mentioned before that you're working on new growth charts. Is that something that we can maybe expect in the near future, or I know that takes a bit of time to get that together?
Yeah, so data that actually Henry and David collected over a long amount of time, which we combined with our data. We analyzed 140 first, and we're working with a statistician in Europe who knows how to make growth charts to find out how many growth charts you need to make a new growth chart. So we have 142. We need to expand that. I don't know what the real number is. I think it's going to be several hundred we need. But if we have 800 patients in Ghana, I don't think you need 800 to make a growth curve. So I think, I don't know, shall I put a date on it? If I put a date on it, Shannon will kill me. But how about a year that it may not be published and peer reviewed, but I think in a year we're going to have a decent version of a growth curve. I've now publicly made a deadline for myself.
And this is being webcast, so.
Okay, but we wouldn't have been able to do it. Henry and collected tons of those data for us. Right, Henry? How painful was that to do?
Medical students did it all.
You have an endless
Pre-med, yeah, Alex. Yeah, I think the hard part about a growth curve is if you were making a growth curve correctly, you would bring the children in every month on the day of the month of exactly 1.0 month, and then the statistics are easy, and you would have them measured by people who are trained to measure children. And so what we get is, 7 weeks, 13 weeks, not measured for now the next 5 months, not on the birthday, on 13 months, So the statistics are actually painfully hard, and the reliability, particularly of the heights, is mediocre. I mean, I think when, you see some of your specialists, they're even willing just to ask you, how long? 27 inches? Yeah, that sounds good. And they'll put it in the computer. Whereas, in the GI, I hope, in every GI office, we torture kids to get the right length. I mean, because that really does sort of matter to us. So it's a guideline. Is it going to look massively different than the one that we made, 20 years ago? It's probably going to be a little bit higher because we're less tolerant of malnutrition. We're more likely to go to a G-tube. We're more likely to put in an NG. And as we said before, it's like also with Turner's syndrome and some other diseases that our goal should not be what was, but what could be. So I think we all feel better when we compare to this old growth curve, but that doesn't mean that should be the benchmark for success. It just gives you a little bit different frame of reference. I think almost always for GI and nutrition, we just always want more. I mean, I think probably rarely have any of your kids heard, oh, you could cut back on the Pediasure and the MCT.
Also, the spectrum of the disease, David, no, is a make it more difficult, no. Like someone that has a more severe, complex heart condition will have a different growth pattern than a chronic liver disease.
Anyone have any questions? Hannah.
So I'm not sure how well this one can be answered, and I'll try to articulate it well. As specialists, a lot of the families see multiple specialists, and they're not always at the same center. So sometimes, say for instance, the child has an incident, and the symptoms might fall under several specialists. How is something the families can do to keep uniformity of care and the future of Alagille's for the sake of, connecting the dots and finding the puzzle pieces while still not putting unruly expectations onto the doctor?
Yeah, I think the single most important thing in that kind of scenario is to be sure that you have every record and that you can bring the record from place to place. And the better quality the record, and certain things really do matter. We can't really see what's been done at another place, and we might not have a relationship with that person. In an ideal world, you would have everything done at the same place, but it's very clear that this place does this thing really well and this place does this really well. But having the records are really like gold, and then the records, years later, somebody says, my daughter was operated on 5 times. Somebody is going to really need those operative reports, and they might need them right now. And if you're calling to the West Coast at 3 in the morning, the chance you're going to get those records within 3 days is probably like close to 0. So it's so much better than it was, because a lot of centers, we can look into their computer from at any time, day or night, but it's very frustrating how many things are not in the part of their computer that allows us to see them. So there's all kinds of data, and it shouldn't really be the family's responsibility, but it's a good way to do it because you can have all of the records given to you digitally from almost any place you've been. And everybody's medical record now, people joke, it's 4,000 pages. It's, I'm gonna strain my back, get a hernia, as everybody says, carrying it around. But you put it all on a flash drive now. And, and I think that really is the wave of the future, is to own it digitally, to have it, make it searchable. The more complicated your care is, the more important it is that you have a copy of the records. You don't have to understand it necessarily, but some of those things are really high value, particularly in emergent situations. Getting people to call, telling people, I want you to send a copy of this to my cardiologist, my endocrinologist. I think we're all willing to do that. That's pretty easy to do these days. It clearly doesn't happen all the time. I think I would encourage every single person to say, when you see my child, I want a copy of your consultation, because I'm the one ultimately, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to be the one who says, if you think that my nephrologist should be doing this and it doesn't happen, I can make it happen because I can bring in both the letter and the nephrology paper. So it's way better than it was. The Affordable Care Act made it. One of the things people don't give it credit for is they made us go to electronic records. They made us allow patients to get their records. That never happened 15 years ago. And I'm sure people in here have stories of they'd go to medical records, they'd have to pay $1 a page, and they'd get the record, a month later. Or people would say they'd send it out, and they never did. it is way better than it was. But for us, we really like to see good records. We're always like that doubting Thomas thing. We want to see the gene test. We want to, see the X-ray, all those things, because it's trust but verify. I went from doubting Thomas to Ronald Reagan.
Can you speak to growth hormone in short stature?
So in some, you want this, Henry? No? In some genetic syndromes, it's really kind of interesting because there are some genetic syndromes where the patient is not growth hormone deficient, and you can give them growth hormone and they grow better. And so Turner syndrome is one example of that, where so it's missing one X chromosome, female, usually not fertile, and a couple of subtle things, and sometimes some heart things, and sometimes missed for years. But we always, and the old growth hormone, the old growth chart for Turner syndrome, you just had an expectation of, I'm not sure of the exact number, but 4'10" was like, oh, you're doing pretty well, kind of thing. And then they started to treat Turner syndrome where the patient had normal amounts of growth hormone, and they grew a lot. And it was really like a success. And now this is a indication for growth hormone, even though growth hormone costs something unbelievable, $20,000, $30,000 or more a year. I'm not really sure what that number is, but it's enough that the insurance companies always say no the first time you apply. So there have been some trials with this. John Bukovalis, Karen McBride Emmerich did some things with this, and it just didn't seem to work in Alagille syndrome. And there seemed to be a growth hormone resistance out of Grimberg in our institution. An endocrinologist did some work on this. I'm not sure that we really know that some structure of growth hormone or the next thing in that sequence further down might not stimulate growth, but right now at least the data has not shown any upside to doing that.
Did transplant have any?
Ooh, the expert on the expert on post-transplant growth velocity, Ruben talked about that really big paper, 45 patients, was that?
No, yeah. 20 something, a long time ago. No,
Long time ago.
I think when you look at growth after transplant, we have to pair. At that time, there were not that many patients. This is back in the 90s. We have to pair about 13 patients to kind of similar. They have heart condition. We pair with some heart condition that didn't get a transplant. So for very complex pairing process or whatever. But at the end, basically, the conclusion was that the kids that have severe liver disease, that's what it looked like, tend to be at the bottom minus C score, like really bottom of the growth chart. And after transplant, they will get better, but it will be similar to their peers. That it wasn't, and some of them were, it will go like in the -2, -1 point something, which is still hitting the regular growth chart, but it was not like, it won't make them taller if you compare them to their peers.
Okay, and we followed up on Ruben's study when we looked at this in 100 patients with Alagille syndrome, and we compared their growth after transplant to patients with biliary atresia. And the biliary atresia patients are bigger overall, but the catch-up growth was greater in the Alagille syndrome group than in biliary atresia, which tells me that there is a benefit to growth after transplant, and it is a substantial benefit. So you're not going to make an Alagille syndrome patient bigger than a biliary atresia patient, but you're going to make them a lot bigger than they would have been if you didn't transplant them, which is supporting.
And the other thing to say is that many of the asymptomatic adults who turn out to have jagged mutations are relatively shorter than you might have expected in their family. So those are people who are asymptomatic, so nutritionally and hepatically, they're as good as a perfect transplant, and yet their growth potential seems to be limited by some percent. So I think, you know, if you're malnourished before transplant and it's because of your disease, things are going to get better. But what is the top asymptote that you're aiming for? I mean, we commonly say, you know, I think we know 2 families where there are 6-footers who have Alagille syndrome. You know, and obviously that's not the normal, you know, U.S. growth curve.
Circling back to the medical records question, one thing is for those of us that have experienced an answer when I say, hey, can I get a copy of that? And they say, no, but you can have another doctor request it. How can I respectfully respond to that? Give me some wording as a professional.
Yeah, so it is yours. I was trying to think of something because we're being recorded. And my colleagues will agree that I have a book on Italian hand gestures that is in my office, and one of those would work, but not on the phone. It is your record, and they can't really do that. And I think you can just, at this point in time, pull rank and tell them. And
Okay.
really, they should not be charging you,
Okay.
you know, for it either. Worst case scenario, I mean, we work very hard to collect records for second opinions. And if we get them in paper, God forbid, we're trying to get away from that, you know, we scan them immediately into our chart. So we never did that before. If we got outside records, our medical records, which, you know, has to pay to house these things, said, no, throw them away. You got to, you know. But now scanners are, you know, high speed, high quality, you know. And we commonly say to the families, we're done with this. Do you want it? Because it is harder for families. But these days, with the digital transmission, and I mean, we're doing things now where you can get your entire record out of CHOP. It takes them about 2 minutes to download it to a PDF. And so, like, it's not, you know, I mean, and we do second opinions. My record for this year, because I was in a project on this, was 5,300 pages. Some kid came from Chicago, and it was like, you know, but that is boxes of records, but it's a flash drive, and you'd rather have it on a flash drive, and then you can manipulate it, highlight it, back it up, you know, put it in your kid's wallet, something like that. But they really, you just, I would just say, it's illegal for you to ask that. Don't do it. I want the record. It's my record. Give me your manager.
Yeah. But may I just also say that in our center, though, if a family asks us, I'm not allowed to print it and hand it to you. I'm not allowed to. But what I have to say to the family is, please go to health records. And the reason for this is patient confidentiality. If you ask me to print off a record and I hand it to you, and then you go to the hospital cafeteria and you leave it there, that's a break in patient confidentiality, and I am liable for that.
Her name's on every page. Yeah.
No, but it's serious. So sometimes they may be not be saying no because they're being difficult, but the correct answer that the physician should give you is, it is your record, but please go to health records and get it from health records. So I often have to say, I'm not allowed to print this for you, but you are absolutely entitled to it, but please get it via health records. Okay, so I think that's just a distinction there, that somebody may be saying no because they've been told by their institution that they're not allowed to print it off. You know, sometimes families come to me and they say, can I just take a picture of this off the screen? And so that one sometimes, because I hope that one's not going to go anywhere, but we are under tremendous pressure now from our institutions to protect your data. It is your data, but there are channels through which you can get it, and me printing it off is sometimes just not allowed. So I hope that clarifies a little bit for you.
And to be fair, not throwing you under, I've never had a physician tell me no, but I have gone to the front desk and them. So I just want to
I would say
fair about that.
two or three things. I mean, sometimes they are being lazy, and sometimes they are being difficult. And like insurance companies, if you back down and go away, they saved something.
Yeah.
So you know, you do
Okay.
have to be persistent.
And a follow-on is when y'all are receiving a package for second opinion, how do you want that organized? What reduces your workload burden? Chronologically, labs in one file, radiology in one file?
So you're obviously lovely about this. We've no, in all seriousness, at least in our institution. So 5 years ago, and maybe this is what you remember, we put all the pressure on the family for a second opinion. We said we won't do a second opinion unless you write a little summary about what you have and what you want from us. Why are you coming for a second opinion? And you get the records. And your records might be in this pediatrician, this GI doctor, this cardiology, blah, blah, blah. And we might get partial records, as well as, even in our institution, and this was probably, shut off the camera, illegal, we had like 65 different chart rooms in one institution. So if you asked GI for their records, you were not going to get cardiology. You had to go to every single place. And if you asked medical records for it, in our institution where we all grew up, you wouldn't get the GI records. And that's still true in a lot of hospitals. So we like keep track of this on a spreadsheet. If we need records from the hospital that is X miles away from us, I'm not going to say because you'll figure it out with Google Maps, we have to not only go to Central, but then we have to go to each division that we want the records from, and they won't do it for us. They won't do it for us. On the other hand, we've figured that out more and more, but what we figured out was, I mean, you guys are great. You traveled to Cincinnati. You clearly committed to this. There are a lot of people who can't do that. The disease has made them broke. They don't have the energy. They don't have the sophistication, and they don't have the leverage, right? Because that person said no to you, and no. So we now have taken over getting the records from almost all other institutions, and we have so we have Epic, which has many pluses and a few minuses. But the minute you register in our system, we generate a letter, and that letter goes to Hospital X, Medical Records Department. It's totally populated with all of your information. You have to send us a cell phone picture of a HIPAA release, because that's required. And it goes it looks official. It's on a color letterhead, right? And I swear, because we've done this now, we have the name of the medical records director, and that's who the letter goes to. And we call them up and we say, but if you're coming from, Maine or Oregon, we don't know those people. But for the 20 GI centers within, 200 miles of us, we took the time to do that. And we don't, I said this in one of the little smaller sessions, we don't allow them to fax it to us like a paper fax anymore. They fax it to a machine. We've all bought these. We just didn't know they did it. And it accepts it as a digital file, converts it to a PDF, and sends it to a second opinion email box where it's then immediately attached to the Epic record without ever burning a sheet of paper. So we were printing faxes and otherwise 200,000 pages of paper a year, which we would get on a fax machine. It's less good than it was. Then we'd copy it so that the fellow and the attending could both have it. And then it'd be laying around. And then we have to pay, we're not even sure exactly how much, but 10 times as much to destroy paper that is medical records compared to destroy paper that is paper. I mean, it's special bins and everything. So we've bypassed that. But it's almost impossible for families to get all the good records, because most families just don't know what's important, what's not. You look and oh yeah, we did go to place X, So it's a real problem though, because good records make better care, no doubt about it.
So we had a caring for the caregiver session in here earlier. Not every parent could be in here for that. Can you guys touch on how important it is for self-care for parents? And then also the importance of adults or young adults or even teens with Alagille, that self-care of maintaining their medical needs and how important that is moving forward.
Why is everyone giving it to me?
She's very
Well, I was part of that session, and I will let some of my colleagues here say something. But I think we talk about how important it is to deal with the initial issues when you make the diagnosis and some of the guilt that comes with it, some of the blame comes into it. We talk about also how you need to keep on checking on the family with a new diagnosis and send to counseling whenever identified. I think we have a responsibility as a medical providers to look after the mental well-being, not only of the patient, but also the siblings and the parents. Also important in the inpatient setup, I think sending parents home is sometimes important. The parents usually, some parents tend to stay there, and some of them have history about a near miss or something almost happened that reinforced, unfortunately, that behavior staying there and burning out. I think it's important to take breaks because it's important for you to be healthy. Siblings need to be involved, but with limitations. There are children also, you have to remember that. But they need to be part of the process. This is a family issue, but the siblings should not be taking care of what the parents should be doing. And I think you have to look after the well-being of the siblings also, mental well-being. Is the child also having the regular social activities and things that they should be having? Look after that. That's extremely important. And I will say it's crucial for you to always identify who is going to help you, because not everybody not all families are able to survive this as a couple, unfortunately. And parents sometimes are left alone. And I talk about a history of one parent with a chronic illness. For me, it was very telling when it happened to me. I have a dad that walked out. I talked to both parents before a procedure, came out of that procedure room to find a mom that was crying because dad left, and we never came back. And that's told me the reality is that sometimes our single parents dealing with this, and I think you have to find networking somewhere. If you have a relative, even the Uncle Bob that comes on Thanksgiving, you don't like it, but if he's willing to help, hey, so be it, come in. And also be willing to accept the help that they want to give you, because sometimes we want more, but you give a little bit, it's good, just take it. We have Spanish saying that you cannot ask a lemon tree to give you apples or sweet apples. Just take the lemons. Make lemonade, I guess. You have to make the best out of it, I think. Those are kind of, in a nutshell, what I will probably advise.
To that, Kathy?
Is this thing on? I think it's on. Is it on? Okay. Yeah, I agree with everything that Ruben just said. I think one of the key things is really being open to accepting help from people when they offer it. You don't want to don't just try and be brave. If somebody says they want to make you dinner, say, okay, great. What day? Do you want to bring it over? Accept help. And, even in the hospital, as we see families that the parents won't leave the bedside, and one of our nurses will go sit at that patient's bedside for an hour and let the mom go outside and walk around and get a cup of coffee and feel that somebody's there to look after the baby, while they're out. Because people just need a little break, a little mental break. You need to get a little bit of sun, go outside. I was just thinking when you were talking about the teens, I don't know if there's probably been some sessions on transition as well that I haven't been part of, but I think that's a key thing as kids are getting older, to kind of really involve them more in the care and the medications and the process of, even refilling medications, making doctor's appointments, things like that, kind of empowering them to become part of the team, because that's going to be really important as they grow older and start transitioning to adult care. We don't want that to be an abrupt change, at a certain age. They're just suddenly released into the adult world, but, at least at our place, there is a team of us that work on transition, and along with our social workers and our psychologists, and trying to make that kind of a process that takes a number of years, not months, but years, in terms of seeing that child gradually take on more responsibility, and the idea of moving into the adult care. I know you might want to speak to that too, because you guys have a process for that that's very nice as well, right?
Yeah, we're quite fortunate in our center. We have a transition clinic for any patients with chronic liver disease, where we send all our patients to the same adult hepatology team, and the adult hepatologist comes to the pediatric liver clinic and does a clinic with us several times a year. So you meet your current doctor and your future doctor together in the room. So, we talk about records being transitioned. There's nothing better than face-to-face. And so you'll meet us all together in the room, and we do a consultation. But I think that's a somewhat unique resource, and that doesn't always happen. So it can be difficult. But certainly, if you are transitioning care, you want to make sure that if Alagille syndrome is rare amongst the pediatric community, it's much more rare amongst the adult community. So you really, it may require a little bit more travel if it does, but you need to try and go to somebody who's seen Alagille syndrome before, because honestly, as an adult, you will get lost in the mix of an adult hepatology practice. But back to Roberta's original question about caring for yourselves and in this, I have to tell you, I don't think we're expert in that. We see you in our clinics a few times a year. You guys are expert in that. This is where I give full respect to our families. You guys live with this every day. You have to know that you are important and need to take care of yourselves, but the roots the mechanisms of how you are going to do this and help each other, I think this is what this symposium is for, and you can share ideas. But I would almost feel, I don't feel like it's my place. All that I know is that you guys need to take care of yourselves, but I don't think that I'm expert to be able to tell you guys that this is what you guys are helping each other with by being here.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and wrap up, but we would love it if any of you have one last thing to say. Any parting words for us?
So it's my understanding that Roberta and Cher have agreed to put together a few proposals to send to the federal government in various ways. And I think it would be extremely powerful if 500 patients and parents would affix their signature to these things, demanding for someone to put in legislation to guarantee that children with chronic nutritional diseases could get vitamins, for instance. Not like gonna sink the federal budget. And of course, the states have to apply that, because all of our kids are on Medicaid, not Medicare. But I think there are a lot of things that are advocacy that could come from the Alliance. People you sign where your district is, and that has traction, and there'll be representatives at the state level or at the federal level. And so some states have started to actually enact those things. And I think one of the unbelievable tragedies to me is like the vitamin deficiencies. That's something we can win. You might need humongous quantities, but you can't do those humongous quantities if it's $600 a month, And so they have generously offered to do about 15 things from this. And I think in advance of them doing it, I think we should all thank them. This was a great session, and it's a great meeting, and we're looking forward to great things.
Thank you.
Well, I know everybody's hungry. We're all set.